In the past few months, whenever I've played Rebirth, there's always been one thing that stood out. You can find games incredibly quickly. Like, after queuing, I'll get put into a lobby within 10 or 15 seconds every game. By contrast, over the games I've played on Caldera, I'd estimate that the average queue time is around 5 or 6 minutes, maybe even longer. There's fewer players in a Rebirth lobby, sure, but we're talking about finding games 30 times as quickly. That would seem to suggest that at least on my servers, the vast majority of players prefer Rebirth. And from what I can see online, this seems to be a general consensus. With that said, and given the requests I've received, I've been meaning to make a Rebirth video for quite some time. The problem was, I just hadn't played it enough. I always liked Verdansk so much that I never really gave Rebirth too much of a chance. But ever since Caldera arrived, I, like many others, have found myself playing Rebirth more and more. And I've come up with a bunch of ideas where I think it, and more importantly, any future Resurgence maps, can be improved. And I'm going to start with some thoughts on the different game modes themselves. As for solos, I think it's great. I couldn't really find anything to complain about. In fact, given how lacking the solos experience in Warzone has always been, I'd argue that it's among the best modes they've ever implemented. Duos, by contrast, is Rebirth's worst mode. There are many players that don't have fun playing it, and it's not hard to see why. Take this example. I get a really cheap kill on this guy with a heli, meaning the radar shows me exactly where his teammate is. This guy was at a huge disadvantage. In duos, it's just too easy for your team to be wiped and for you to be out of the game, with the consequence of this being that lobbies die out far too quickly. By the end of the first circle, half the lobby will probably be gone. There's often less than 10 plays by the end of the second. And as for the third, well, it might be the last one. I've had games that don't make it to the fourth circle. When you think about how respawning works, it's obvious as to why this happens. After dying in Rebirth, you only respawn if your teammate survives a specific number of seconds. For duos, it's 15 seconds during the first circle, 20 during the second, and 30 during the third until Rebirth is disabled in the fourth circle. Now here are the quads numbers. Let's say you've just died, and let's say you're in the first circle. In duos, you've got one teammate left, and in quads, you've got 3. Do you think it's easier for an opposing team to kill one player in 15 seconds, or 3 players in 25? It's this one, of course. It's not even close. On top of this, there's actions that decrease the timer, things like looting crates, or picking up contracts, or getting downs and kills. In quads, you have 3 teammates. 3 teammates working to decrease your respawn timer. This is why quads is so much better. When you die, there's a really good chance you come back. The same can't be said for duos. The respawn system is designed for game modes with multiple teammates, but it's applied to duos where you only have one. Now, there's many things you could do to make duos better. One suggestion I've seen is to increase the player count, say, going from 46 to 60 players. More teams would surely make the games go longer, but it would also mean more chaos and, dare I say it, even more third parties. You'd be heading back to the main menu even more frequently. A better solution would look to decrease the respawn times. Doing so would mean players respawn more often, making games go longer. But I think duos needs an even bigger change, and I would like to see it take some inspiration from solos. What if, instead of respawning depending entirely on your teammate's ability to survive, it also depended on how long you survived? A hybrid system. That is, the respawn times remain as is, but every player gets a personal timer. With this system, here's how a duos game would look. At the start, just like solos, you get a respawn. You can go to Control Center, instantly get wiped, and then both come back. Straight away, this extends the game. 5 teams aren't gone in the first 30 seconds. After landing back in, the timer starts, and if you survive the timer, you get to come back. Just like solos, doing contracts and getting kills decreases it. You get rewarded for actually moving around and fighting and getting kills. What's more, since you're no longer solely reliant on your teammates to respawn, they can die over and over again. That's okay, as long as you're playing well, such that you're surviving these times, you'll be able to come back. On the other hand, if you're dying over and over, you can still rely on your teammates. And later in the game, when all the times increase, you don't have to tell your teammate to go and sit in a corner for 30 seconds. If they really want, they can try their hand at climbing this ladder. It won't go well, but they've earned a respawn. They're coming back, meaning your timer will continue to count down so you can come back as well. Is this a perfect solution? Certainly not. Of course, somebody could come up with something more insightful that's far easier to implement, but the solution itself isn't really the point. They could do something as simple as adding an extra life so that teams get one chance to respawn after getting wiped. That would still be great. Any change that leads to teams surviving longer is a massive improvement over current duos. It doesn't matter what they do, they just need to do something. Trios and quads are my favorite Rebirth modes, but only when I'm playing with people I know. Playing with randoms is night and day. Are they going to buy me back after Rebirth is disabled? Are they going to drop money so we can buy a loadout? Am I going to start the game with a full squad? Are my teammates going to leave as soon as they die? These last two are the most important. If you're playing trios and one of your teammates leaves, you're suddenly playing a much worse version of Rebirth duos, fighting teams of 3 instead of 2. You shouldn't be punished for your teammate backing out because they died, and you certainly shouldn't be punished for not being given a teammate to begin with. With that said, I wanted to get a sense for how often this occurred. I played 50 trios games and 50 quads games, and I recorded how many teammates I started each game with and how frequently my teammates would leave. Here are the numbers for trios. In 34 games, 68% of the time, I started the game with a full squad, and in 6 games, 12% of the time, I wasn't given any teammates. The other side of the table represents the team size at the end of the game. That is, it's measuring how often people would leave games early. For example, in 14 games, I finished the game as a duo, meaning 14 is the sum of the times where I started the game as a duo and finished as a duo, and the times where I started the game as a trio and finished as a duo. Keep in mind, I didn't count it as leaving a game when my teammates played out the entire game and then left after Rebirth was disabled. This happened almost every time the game lasted that long. This number summarizes the results quite well. It says, how often was I playing random fill trios from start to finish as a trio with 2 teammates? 58% of the time. That's not very good. Then again, I assumed this number would have been far lower, but random fill trios was a little better than I expected. But what about quads? As before, the same summary table can be created, where these numbers have the same interpretations. And again, this number says how often I was playing quads with 3 teammates, a full squad. Only 18 games, a little over 1/3 of the time. That's pretty bad. If the devs want to improve the Resurgence game mode for the many players that play with randoms, they need to ask the following. How can we better fill lobbies so that players start with a full squad? And how can we prevent players from leaving games? Starting with the first question, I'll be the first to admit that I know precisely nothing about programming matchmaking, but I think I can make one useful observation. In each Rebirth mode, there's a maximum number of players that can fit in a lobby, and in several games where I wasn't given a full squad, this maximum was reached. Designing it like this is problematic. A trio's lobby, for instance, can fit 45 players, 15 teams of 3. If one team elects to play as a duo, such that they choose the don't fill option, there will be 44 players left. As such, if anyone else joins a lobby, they'll be left short-handed. There's no room to join a different team, and the maximum of 45 has been reached, so there's no room to add additional players to the lobby. The easy way to address this is to place a limit on the number of teams, not the number of players. In this example, had there been a predefined trios limit of, say, 15 teams, then this player wouldn't be going into this game as a solo because they wouldn't get placed in that lobby to begin with. Doing it like this would just mean there were fewer times you were going into a Rebirth game without any teammates. What about preventing players from leaving games? This is something I've seen talked about a lot, and the suggested solution is generally, we need a quitting penalty. That is, if someone leaves a game or two early, they need to be penalized, say, having to wait a few minutes before they can queue again, and if they keep quitting, this time increases. This would probably work, but it brings some problems. What happens when you disconnect? Do we really trust they'll be able to distinguish someone lagging out from someone quitting? What's more, Rebirth's not a competitive mode. If someone's really not having fun, for whatever reason, they should be able to back out without penalty. And regardless, if someone wants to quit a game, but they don't because they'll be penalized, I'm not convinced they'd be that great of a teammate anyway. I think, instead of asking how we can prevent players from leaving, we should ask, how can we make it more enjoyable for the remaining players? Not only would this address the cases where your teammates quit, but also when they lag out, or when you're not given a teammate at the start. And I think the solution is kind of obvious. These are the respawn times for each circle in duos, trios, and quads. Here's what's interesting. If you're playing quads, and if you're in the second circle, the respawn time is 35 seconds. If one teammate leaves, the respawn time is 35 seconds. If 2 teammates leave, the respawn time is still 35 seconds. So if you're playing a quads game, and if you've only got one teammate left, not only are you fighting 2v4s, But if your teammate dies, you'll need to survive 35 seconds, almost twice that of normal duos. Keep in mind, the 20 seconds for normal duos is too high. It doesn't work. So how do you think someone's going to go having to survive 35 seconds and having to survive that time while fighting teams of 4? Rebirth revolves around your teammates surviving so you can respawn, but the times don't change depending on how many teammates you have. It's nonsensical. Here's how it should work. When you're playing quads and one teammate leaves, the respawn times should dynamically change in-game to match those of regular trios. In fact, since playing trio quads is harder than regular trios, there should be some number less than these. In the cases where you're left playing duo quads or duo trios, you could make the numbers similar to normal duos. However, this wouldn't help much because you'd still be playing duos, which is just the worst. So ideally, they'd first fix duos and then apply the fix to these cases, adjusting appropriately for the added difficulty of fighting extra players. Lastly is the cases where you're left playing solo. These are actually the worst ones, because if you die, your game is over. You don't get to respawn at all. Of course it shouldn't work like this. After all your teammates leave, you should then be given a solo's respawn timer. Now, not everyone is going to want to continue playing a trios game by themselves. That's okay. But for those that do, give them a chance to actually play, to actually enjoy a game, to have more than one death before their game ends. My prior videos talked about many gameplay related problems, and since those videos, many of the things I mentioned got fixed. For example, you can now cut your parachute when you're close to the ground. This wasn't always the case. Now, those videos were very long, and for the sake of not repeating myself, just note that most of the problems that weren't fixed are also applicable to Rebirth. Airstrikes still kill you through buildings. Ziplines are still a guaranteed death. Still, here are some areas related to Rebirth's gameplay that I wanted to draw particular attention to, starting with mantling. I feel like you just automatically mantle over everything on this map. Every now and then, I get killed because the game just throws me off a building. Nova. Control. Prison. This box. Everything vaults you over. Auto-mantling was pretty bad on Verdansk, and there's some really annoying spots on Caldera, but it might be worse on Rebirth. Another thing that's really prominent on Rebirth is mantling objects while shooting. It's no secret that jumping is an essential part of winning gunfights, and once you do it enough, it almost becomes muscle memory to jump while shooting, at least at close range. The problem is when you unintentionally mantle something close by, and it forces you to stop ADSing. When this happens, it'll often get you killed. I don't know why you would ever want to mantle something while you're shooting or ADSing, it just shouldn't be possible. The most significant change of the recent updates was increasing Rebirth's base health from 100 to 150. On Caldera, this is exactly what most players wanted, and it works really well. You might be alive for 25 minutes. Each life means more. With only 100 HP, you don't have that extra time to get to cover. With 100 HP on Rebirth, it's also true that you die really quickly. Here, with almost full plates, I died in just 7 bullets, at decent range, to an XM4. With that said, I'm not sure too many people were bothered by this. Rebirth games are shorter, and if you're lucky to have some decent teammates, you might respawn 6, 7, even 8 times in a single match. Each life doesn't mean as much, and 150 HP just feels off. I shouldn't have survived this. This guy should have gone down sooner. If 2 players run up that staircase, instead of 1, you lose. I don't even want to talk about this new snake perk, or whatever it's meant to do. You could maybe argue that 100 HP was too little, but 150 is definitely too much. I've just got some brief thoughts on buy stations. First, why can't you buy teammates back for free during a fire sale? It's free on the other maps, but it costs 1500 on Rebirth? I don't really get it. Also, I never really understood why some buy stations don't spawn. You'll often need to buy a quick set of plates, but you can't. Or you'll have enough money for an early loadout, but you'll need to go halfway across the map because the 3 closest buy stations aren't there. Spawning all the buy stations in every match would be a welcomed change. Out of the 3 Warzone maps, I feel that Verdansk, at least towards the end of its lifespan, had the best audio. Caldera's a step down, and Rebirth's on par with Caldera. Supposedly, the audio was improved in the most recent patch, but but I personally can't notice a difference. Countless times, there's a guy running right behind me and I can't hear a thing. To be fair, I don't know if this is always a complete lack of footstep audio, or I just can't hear them because half the time I'm playing this game mode, there's an airstrike overhead. Like, why are so many airstrikes lying around? And why are there airstrikes in every other chest? A good start to improving Rebirth's audio would be to decrease the spawn rate of airstrikes by around 99%. Also, why is the fire sale notification twice as loud as anything else in the game? Surely it couldn't take more than 5 minutes to lower the volume. Next is the vertical audio. Warzone's always had this problem. It's just more pronounced on Rebirth. Prison, Nova, Chemical, Bio, Control. Anywhere you go, you're dealing with horrible vertical audio. Are they above? Are they below? Are they on the same level? I have no idea. Of all the comments I've received talking about problems with Rebirth, the most common is about campers. Camping this tower, camping buildings, camping loadouts. If you want to stay in the same spot all game, by all means. I just think the map could be made a little less favourable to players that don't like to move around. Take, for instance, this tower. I'm not saying it's as bad as this one, but it can't be far off. From the top, players get a 360-degree view of the map, and from the bottom, there's next to zero counterplay. One ladder to the top, so it's impossible to push, and even if you get a knock, you can't really get the full. The only way to get to the top is by landing in, but even then, it's pretty hard to get the kill with some crappy pistol. Though, trying to fight the tower isn't the worst part. It's that, when you're trying to fight elsewhere, there's always someone shooting at you from this tower. It's one of the worst things about this map. The thing is, it's kind of a hard problem to fix. A ladder on the outside would take too long. Zip lines are still zip lines. Maybe one of those spiral staircases might be an idea? Probably not. When I saw they were adding balloons, I thought this tower was one of the reasons. Imagine being able to land on these guys with an actual loadout gun. I would go out of my way to do this every game. But the Rebirth balloons give very little height and distance. And if balloons aren't the answer, then I'm not sure what is. Would getting rid of it altogether be that bad? The second worst thing about this map is probably the water tower. I never thought it was that bad, but ever since the snipers got nerfed, camping up there makes it so hard to die, yet it's so easy to mount up and get kills. Aside from the towers, I don't have much else to say. Maybe it could be made a little easier to rotate from some POIs. A good example is living quarters to headquarters. There just isn't enough cover to be fighting players uphill. And maybe a few more jump spots or ladders would be good. The rooftop below the tower, for example, can only be accessed via a single ladder, so anyone on that rooftop is kind of invincible. A ladder on the outside totally fixes that. The only other thing I'd like to mention is how much everyone loves to camp loadouts. It's a really good strategy, and it'll almost certainly net you a couple of kills, because, for one, loadouts often land in really bad areas. Below the hill at living quarters, smack bang in the middle of prison, right next to this house. It makes it really hard to get a loadout without dying. Next, loadouts often land in groups. This is a duos game, and there's only 10 teams remaining. 3 loadouts dropped here, and 2 more just a little bit up the hill. It is only the start of the second zone. The circle is this big. Why are half the loadouts landing so close to each other? Even if all the teams were close by, spreading them out a little bit would make it so much easier, because right now, grabbing the free loadout is far too often a lot harder than it should be. In the past few months, Warzone has received a lot of updates, and I think most would agree, there's been a lot of really good changes. As an example, my previous video talked about how awful Caldera's launch was, and quite literally, every single thing I mentioned was addressed in some way. What's more, one theme of the recent updates have been quality of life changes, and again, these have essentially been a collection of things I've previously talked about. Some of these were very obvious, long-standing problems, and I simply reiterated what everyone had already complained about. But many problems I mentioned were pretty unique to my videos. Not many people, much less the developers themselves, were emphasizing the so-called little things. All in all, about half of the problems I highlighted are no longer problems. They are now fixed in the game. It's also worth mentioning that the range of times I spent talking about each problem and suggesting solutions was very wide. I spent a really long time, close to 5 minutes, talking about the HUD, which we got, and I spent 5 seconds talking about the inability to move over downed players, which is still the same. That is to say, proportionally speaking, the number is different. It's more like 70%. That's crazy, right? I'm genuinely curious as to how many times they've watched my videos. It's not surprising that so many of you instantly came back to comment with each new update. But to answer the common question of whether or not I received any credit, no. Absolutely nothing.